Happy Friday afternoon to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for joining us today as we are concluding our walk through the book of the Judges. Today we are in Judges 21, and we are going to be putting a nice finishing bow, at least as nice of a finishing bow as you can put on such a pretty disastrous commentary of this section of the history of Israel. We're going to be concluding looking at the efforts that are being put forth by Israel today to rectify some of the issues that they created for themselves in the previous chapter, in chapter 20, concerning the continuation of the Benjaminite line. We're going to look at their solutions and some of the, again, poor decision making that takes place here, but also making some connections to the future about why even this poor decision making ends up being something that was necessary for Israel's future. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've been with us throughout our entire walk through Judges, thank you so much for doing that. Thank you for giving us that time. I hope it's been a blessing to you. And if you've been with us from the very beginning, today is our 76th study, I do believe, since we began in Genesis way back last year. We're coming up on a year, almost a year worth of these studies. Thank you for being here, and we hope that it has been a blessing to you. And with us all along the way is my good friend Alan. Alan, good to see you this afternoon, and thank you for everything that you've done in this series up to this point.
Would you say we're walking through history or slowly trudging or
Well,
skipping through history?
I definitely don't think we would win any Olympic brisk walking competitions. I don't think that at all. But it's been really good. I will say that even though it has been maybe a bit of a trudge, it's been very beneficial for me just to really solidify my understanding of the history of Israel. And I've never done anything in this manner where just go and walk through it in such detail. It's either been a very brisk overview or skimming from point to point, not really studying the narrative as in depth as we have. So for me, it's been extremely beneficial. I feel a blessing to have been here along with you, because we are not just teaching, but we are having to study and learn ourselves.
Oh yeah.
Diving in a much deeper level into the text than maybe we've done before. And I know it's helped me, and I hope it's been a good reminder for you. I know you're a history buff and you really like the Old Testament history story. So a lot of this, I'm sure, is old hash for you, but man, it's been great having you do this with me, and I really appreciate it. And we're going to check off another book after today's study before we get into Ruth next week. Going to cover the book of Ruth, 4 chapters, 4 studies over the next 2 weeks.
A much quicker book than any of the others we've done.
That's right. We don't anticipate these being those Ruth studies being extremely long studies, those Tuesday and Friday. So we'll get you in and out a little bit quicker. But here in Judges 21, Alan, why don't you catch our audience up on why we are facing what we're facing here in Judges 21? What it is we're facing.
Yeah, this story's come in 3 parts. So chapter 19, 20, and 21 are all one story together. Chapter 19 was the story of the Levite that had the concubine. They traveled to Gibeah, which is a Benjamite town, so a town of Israel. And we remember what happened to the concubine. She gets abused all night and killed. The Levite ends up chopping her into 12 pieces and sending her throughout the entire nation. And that's where chapter 20 picked up, where we see the whole all of Israel gathering together to do something about this great sin. And we see just, it sounds good. Okay, we're coming, this town was wicked. They did a terrible thing. We're going to punish them. Well, that's not exactly what happened. The people came together. They didn't really consult God very much. When they did fight against Gibeah, they were end up fighting the entire tribe of Benjamin and almost completely wiping them out, down to just maybe a couple hundred men left. And that's where we're at here in chapter 21 is Israel finally kind of slows down and says, okay, we've punished them enough. We've got a problem here. We've almost completely destroyed an entire tribe of our nation. So chapter 21 is, again, them trying to rectify situations and very little consulting of God in what they're doing here. And you'll see, even though they saved Benjamin from being completely wiped out, they by their own hand, but they do it in almost an even worse way.
That's right. It is a classic example of men taking matters into their own hands, creating a whole bunch of problems, and then finding even worse solutions to those problems. Man, that almost sounds like some entity that exists today. Starts with a G. We're not going to get into that. But yeah, let's get into the text, Alan, looking at the problems that are had, because what we see brought up in chapter 21 isn't mentioned in chapter 20.
Mhm.
This is something that has to be detailed for us, that took place back in chapter 20, and how now this is becoming an issue. In Judges 21, beginning of verse 1, where we read that the men of Israel, those who had gone up against the tribe of Benjamin, originally it was going to be just Gibeah was going to be the enemy, but then Benjamin rallied around their city, so they ended up wiping out nearly all of Benjamin. But here's where the problem comes. The men of Israel had sworn an oath at Mizpah that none of us will give his daughter to a Benjaminite in marriage. So the people went to Bethel and sat there before God until evening. They wept loudly and bitterly and cried out, "Why, Lord God of Israel, has it occurred that the one tribe is missing in Israel today?" The next day, the people got up early, built an altar there, and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. The Israelites asked, "Who of all the tribes of Israel didn't come to the Lord with the assembly? For a great oath had been taken that a great oath had been taken that anyone who had not come to the Lord at Mizpah would certainly be put to death." But the Israelites had compassion on the brothers, the Benjaminites, and said, "Today a tribe has been cut off from Israel. What should we do about the wives for the survivors? We've sworn to the Lord not to give any of our daughters as wives." And they asked, "Which city among the tribes of Israel didn't come to the Lord in Mizpah?" It turned out that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp and the assembly, for when the roll was called, no men were there from the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead. We have here, Alan, an issue that has arisen before in our study through the Judges: rash oaths, taking an oath, not really thinking it through, not considering the consequences of such an oath. I'm very much reminded in this text of Jephthah
Mhm.
and what took place within his story. But there are two oaths that are taken here, Alan. What are those two oaths, and why do they lead us to the issues that we see here?
Well, of course, the first one, none of us will give his daughter to a Benjamite in
Mhm.
marriage. It's kind of funny. Back in 20, we talked about how they came together and they kept inquiring or asking of God, and they kept asking kind of the wrong thing. And you get the sense that they weren't asking, it was lip service. They weren't really asking permission and advice and counsel of God. They were just kind of going through the motions. Hey, should we do this? Like, they were doing it already. And
Yeah,
you
I
see
agree.
what other stuff they were doing. They were angry. I mean, they were so mad that they made this rash oath. None of us will give his daughter. And it's almost childlike to think
Mhm.
of these kind of things. Just, oh, this sounds good. We're never gonna let. I'm never gonna let my daughter marry a Benjamite. Well, it's okay. Calm down. Calm down. It's not that big a deal. These things pass over eventually. 10, 20 years, you're not going to remember that you're mad at the Benjamites. But I mean, that's what happened. And now I love verse 3. They cried out, "Why, Lord God of Israel, has it occurred that one tribe is missing in Israel today?"
Yeah.
Like, did you not forget why you
Mhm.
went out and killed them all yourself? Like, they're wondering why this has happened, and they forgot already that they're the ones that did this. And then even in verse 4, they're coming, and it sounds good. They're doing burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Well, there's fellowship, and then there's what's called a sin offering. We don't see any sin offerings. They're not really, burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Those are just kind of the ritualistic. You go on Passover, you go on whenever, and you offer burnt. It's kind of like worship. Whereas it's the sin offerings that you go for specific sins. That's kind of thing that the Day of Atonement, there were sin offerings then. So they're still, I mean, they're going through the rituals, but they're their understanding of it. I mean, they don't realize all the sins that they've committed, all the they don't realize that it's their fault that all this has happened. And now we have this oath. They at least have some compassion on the Benjamites, and they're trying to figure out a solution. But again, where's God in all this? I don't
Right.
see. I mean, I don't think the Lord even has a quote in this whole section, giving
Right.
his counsel or whatever. There's no asking of his counsel. All they do is just figure out that uh, they're really coming up with a back door. They, just like Jephthah, he made this rash oath. Well, they're, you know, he ended up doing it. I mean, in my opinion, but here, like, they're just trying to get out of this oath in some kind of devious fashion. And the way they do that is they figure out who wasn't there. And it was Jabesh Gilead, which is a town other side of the Jordan, probably about as far, either they didn't hear about it or they was just too far. They couldn't make it, but they're the ones that just didn't show up for this whole powwow at Bethel. So they
And they really do become the scapegoats. That's what
Mhm.
they are. They're just scapegoats.
Yep.
They're because they made one rash vow, they take a second rash vow and they just put them together and come up with a bunch of mess is really what they end up doing. And as we mentioned back with the Jephthah story, there was an opportunity here for them to rectify these poor oaths, these rash oaths, without having to do what they did here within this chapter. Go back to Leviticus 27 and verses 1 through 8. You can offer up money as a way, as a payment for a rash oath that has been given. And maybe it is they don't know that provision within the law, and that in and of itself is problematic, that they're not familiar with the law enough in order to know how to deal with this particular mistake that they have made. And again, it's a comedy of errors. It is mistake after mistake after mistake, which ends up in concluding in just horrible, wicked behavior towards women, which has really been a key theme of this section, has been bad behavior towards women, not giving any amount of respect or care towards women that God would expect for that to be done. And continually women are going to suffer for that. So we get to this solution that they've come up with, that we're going to use Jabesh Gilead as the scapegoat, and we're going to use them in order to rectify this issue. What they do is they gather together 12,000 brave soldiers or brave warriors in verse 10, and they go to Jabesh Gilead, and the commands are to go and to kill the inhabitants with the sword, including women and dependents. This is what you should do: completely destroy every male, as well as every woman who has gone to bed with a man. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not gone to bed with a man, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh in the land of Canaan. And the whole congregation sent a message of peace to the Benjaminites who were at Ramon Rock. And Benjamin returned at that time, and Israel gave the women they had kept alive from Jabesh Gilead, but there were not enough for them. So we go from this last chapter, and it is so ridiculous that the mindset that they have here, where they say, well, how does this happen? Well, it's because we did this. A complete lack of self-awareness really is the issue here. And that's not helped anywhere. They say, okay, well, because we killed these people too much, let's go and kill these other people that are also a part of us in order to rectify it's just, again, it's ridiculous. It's an absolutely ridiculous situation. And the worst part about it maybe is that it still didn't rectify the situation. It still didn't make everything it still didn't help everything to be resolved, because remind us, Alan, how many men were left at that rock?
Let's see. I think it was 600.
How many young women did they find here?
They got 400 from Jabesh Gilead, so they need 200 more.
Yeah. What do they do next, Alan? How do they try to go from here?
So let's see. They come up with another loophole.
It's
See,
a
I
good
think
word. That's a good word to remember today, is loophole.
yeah. So I think verse 16, the elders of the congregation said, "What should we do about wives for those who are left, since the women of Benjamin have been destroyed?" They said, "There must be heirs for the survivors of Benjamin, so that a tribe of Israel will not be wiped out. We can't give them our daughters, for the Israelites had sworn, anyone who gives a wife to a Benjamite is cursed." They also said, "Look, there's an annual festival to the Lord in Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem and south of Lebonah. Then they commanded the Benjamites, go and hide in the vineyards, watch, and when you see the young women of Shiloh come out to perform the dances, each of you leave the vineyards and catch a wife for yourself from the young women of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers come to us and protest, we will tell them, show favor to them, since we did not get enough wives for each of them in the battle. You didn't actually give the woman to them, so you are not guilty of breaking your oath. So what they say is,
Oh
instead
my
of giving
goodness.
them wives from among, specifically Shiloh, if the Benjamites will just come and take them, then we did not break our oath. We didn't give them. They were stolen from us, and we'll just forgive them at that point, I guess, and let it go. So the Benjamites agree. So they're as guilty as well. They took the number of women they needed from the dancers. They I don't even want to imagine what this scene looked like. All these women, like a little
Terrible.
parade, and then
Terrible.
here comes these left-handed Benjamites, grab them, and I don't. Have you ever seen the movie Seven Brides for Seven Brothers?
I have not, no.
Oh, it's like a 50s musical, and basically these brothers live in the mountains, and they come to town to like basically snatch a wife, and that's what they end up doing. They just like throw them on their shoulders, they throw them in the carts, and they bring them back up to their mountain, and then like there's an avalanche, so they're all stuck up there on this mountain homestead
Oh
for the rest
man.
of the movie, and they all get married, but that's how they get their wives, is they
No,
they just go snatch them. And
Melanie has told me about your guys dating time, and I think she actually referenced this particular text. No, I'm just kidding.
Probably.
No, smooth talker Alan with the piano skills. That's why I got his wife.
Yep.
I mean, it is humorous to an extent, just the ridiculousness of this game. But at the same, but the reality is this is terrible. This is absolutely awful. This is a time of celebration, as you mentioned, for these women. They're more than likely they're professional dancers. This is what they do. This is their responsibility in this festival, and it goes from being a time of celebration to a time of terror where they're being grabbed and snatched away by men they don't know and made to be wives. We talked about. I mentioned the lack of understanding of the law, the provision to be able to get rid of these bad oaths. Look at verse 19 again, Alan, where they're told there's an annual festival to the Lord in Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebonah. Shouldn't they know this already? It seems to me almost like they don't know where Shiloh is. They don't know what's going on here, which seems to be to me an evidence, a further evidence of their lack of understanding of the law,
Mhm.
lack of understanding of what's going on. They should not have to be told this. They should know where Shiloh is. It's where the tabernacle is. They should know about these provisions, but they don't. And because they don't know the Lord, and a result of not knowing the Lord is not knowing His law, then all this is taking place. If they had just done what was necessary from the beginning, and this really is the beginning. We talked about this in our last class, that this is all taking place during the time of Phineas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, his time as a priest, which is early on in the judge's story. It is that lack of knowledge and that lack of ability to follow the Lord, which leads to all these issues. And of course, that it's all summed up in verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. That really is the stamp, and that's not the
Mhm.
first time. We've seen that 4 times already. That is a qualifying statement to help us understand why these issues are taking place. Everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. Let's mention here, Alan, that nowhere is there any inquiry of the Lord. At least we give a little credit back in chapter 20 that even if it was a lip service, eventually it seems like they really inquired of the Lord. There is no inquiry of God here at all. They're just doing whatever they want to do. And what that leads to is again what we've seen in these last 3 chapters. And we go back to chapter 19. There's the violent abuse and the murder of the concubine. Chapter 20 There's slaughter of Israelites there. And then in the beginning part of 21, there's more problematic. There's the problematic oaths here, which leads to the slaughter of Israelites, which again ends in the abuse of these young women, 600 young women. That's a chiastic structure that takes place here in chapters 19, 20, and 21. But it all centers here around these oaths that were rashly taken, and then they were ignorant in the way they fixed them, and they didn't inquire of the Lord, and it leads to death, destruction, heartache, and broken lives. And I think I just summed up Judges.
And just I love that twice in this chapter. I mean, they find, I mentioned these loopholes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's one thing, even people that aren't, the best Christians or the best Jews, like they know a lot of the law, or they know the things they can do, but to think that these are okay, like, okay, we made this oath, but let's see if we can find a workaround to get around it. I mean, to me, that's the application here, that we try to do that all the time. Well, we I think of just lying, I didn't lie, I told a little fib, and we have excuses for this and that, and we try to, okay, yeah, I'm not supposed to lie, but if I don't say anything, is that same as a lie? Those types of issues where we're trying to get our way and pay lip service, I guess, to what the law says. And I mean, to me, that's like half of Jesus's message throughout the Gospels, is him just getting on to the Pharisees and the scribes for not understanding the law. And they understood it. They were following it so to the T, and so so perfectly, that they lost the whole meaning of the law, the love part, the compassion part, the
Right.
desire to do what's right. There's no desire to do what's right here. They're just trying to have their cake and eat it too. They made an oath. All rats, we can't break this oath. Well, how do we get around it? Let's come up with a workaround. Let's come up with an excuse. Let's anything to where we don't actually break our oath, but we get what we want as well. And again, that's everyone did whatever seemed right. That's what seemed right to them. They're wanting to get their way, do whatever they want. They'll pay their lip service to God. They're trying to, trying to appease God, but still act like Canaanites. And, what does Jesus say? You cannot serve two masters like that. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're trying to serve themselves and serve God at the same time. We tend to just lump them into just Canaanite, idol worshipers. Well, that's not necessarily. Usually, it's not just that. They're usually trying to do both. They're mixing and matching in whatever way they can, and I mean, that makes me think of the Church of Laodicea. I mean, I'd rather you be hot or cold than lukewarm. Half and half. That's even worse. Just either go all the way bad or come back all the way good. But you're in the middle, and that's an even more dangerous place. Because you see, I mean, they don't even understand what they're doing wrong here. They don't understand what's happened, why this has happened. And that's why this whole story got worse and worse, because they didn't even realize they were getting worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this isn't the last time that we'll hear about Jabesh Gilead in the Old Testament. And think about 1 Samuel chapter 11, where, as you mentioned in our last study, the most famous product of Gibeah, which is King Saul. Even before he becomes king, Jabesh Gilead is attacked by, I believe it's Ammonites there in 1 Samuel 11, and there's a call sent out for people to come help. They say, they just give up. Jabesh Gilead just gives up, say, hey, we'll just give up to you. And the king says, well, let me pluck out your right eye first. Like, okay, we're not just going to give up to you. Give us a week to try to see if there's anybody that's going to stand up for us. If not, then we'll give ourselves to you. They send out messengers, and the messenger comes to Gibeah, and they find Saul, and Saul apparently is very familiar with the history of these people. And it seems to be one of the motivations is that he realizes he would not be where he is today if it were not for the sacrifice, a forced sacrifice though, of the people of Jabesh Gilead. So what does he do? He cuts up an oxen and he sends it about. He does exactly what we see within the story, what made all this happen in the first place. And he goes and he fights for for the people and delivers them. So it's just very interesting to see the connections between that story and the story that we have here today. And we're good. Sneeze one away. I knew that would happen. Alan, what do you have here to finish up with this particular chapter? And then we'll do a quick little rundown of just what we've seen in Judges throughout these last few weeks in these studies.
Yeah, we can do the rundown. I'm good with this chapter.
All right.
I'm done with it.
Yes, it's we being dads to girls. You have your daughter Annabelle, my daughters Olivia and Gabby. We certainly do not appreciate the mistreatment of women from these chapters, and it definitely should be a very strong message to us to make sure that we are giving proper value to all people. Unfortunately, that the context of the Bible, not the Bible itself, but the context in which these stories took place, and the context in which these stories were written, there was very little value given to women. Now, the Bible gives value. The Bible and the God who inspired the Bible, he gives value to women, but the context in which these things were written, there was not that value for women. We need to be more like God. We need to be more about what his word teaches about loving others, giving value to all people, because all people are made in the image of God and deserving of that. That certainly is a lesson to take away from this, not just treating people like merchandise or like goods that could be taken or given. People are people. They have inherent value as people made in the image of God. Let's see here. Let's pull up my secondary screen just to kind of do a brief review of what we have here within Judges. Alan, that of course there's the Judges cycle that takes place. Actually, let's look at the ring structure first of all. On the far right hand side, Way's ring structure of Judges. It's found in the Judges and Ruth book that he has, that we've been using to prep for this study. Just shows that the interconnectivity between these various stories. We talked about the comparisons and contrasts that can be found between the prologue and the epilogue, and the same could be true just for Gideon's story alone. It kind of finds itself as a center portion of this book. There's a good prologue and epilogue session within his story, and then in between and throughout, we just have these judges, and they, as can be seen on the middle chart there, they go from worst to worst. They begin with Othniel, who seems to be a pretty good guy, and Ehud and Shamgar begin to get a little hairy because they just kill people basically. By the time we get to Brak and Deborah, Brak's just a pansy. He's weak. He's relying on Deborah to do what he ought to do. Gideon goes from being nothing to the Lord's Spirit coming upon him being something, to him then becoming a little too big for his britches, and really setting up what we have the rest with Abimelech and Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson. They all have at least the ones that we have greater detail of. They all have issues, and even the shorter ones, Alan, you mentioned as we went through there, the way they're described shows the issues that they themselves had, and it all culminates in the epilogue. Why was it like this? Well, because this is the circumstance that all these, it's the context in which all these things took place. They were bad because things were really bad from the beginning whenever we get into Judges. And it's really sad to see that be the reality of God's people, especially following the conquest of Joshua. Why don't you talk a minute about that, Alan? Just the way that the conquest of Joshua, how it is kind of undone, or it really is undone by what we see within Judges.
Well, I mean, just think about the hope and the how Joshua began. I mean, you go in, they conquer Jericho, have a little bit of trouble with Ai, but then the rest of Joshua is pretty positive. I mean, they pretty much take out the middle section, and they move north, and they move south, and there's still stuff left over by the end of Joshua that it's clear, like it's, they've done a lot of work, but there's still more to happen. and even with this epilogue, it mentions some of the numbers that they had, and if that took place pretty close to the time of Joshua, I mean, they're still a mighty force, but now they've had to turn against themselves, and 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 just the attitudes that there were snippets in Joshua with the instance of Ai.
Right.
Um,
Right.
you remember they didn't really inquire of God when uh, I think the Gibeonites came
Hmm.
and kind of fooled them into making this treaty. So now you're stuck again, another oath that they made, without really thinking, and then they have to keep it. So you're starting, if you didn't know Judges before you got to Joshua, you'd start to think you might see some kind of foreshadowing there. But then, of course, with Judges, it just gets worse and worse. And we talked about like the days of Samson and Gideon, just the state of the nation, or that at least that area of the nation. Gideon was scared of the Midianites, that he couldn't even thresh his wheat in the right place. He had to go to a different place just to avoid getting caught and all his stuff stolen. And Samson, I mean, they were completely at the mercy of the Philistines during that time. They had to, sometimes they're hiding in caves, sometimes their numbers are way down from what it is in the epilogue here or in the days of Joshua. And of course, that wasn't the plan at all. I mean, what was the plan? They were supposed to be this great nation. I mean, they were hundreds of thousands of people that came across the Red Sea and marched through the wilderness and came across the Jordan River and began to conquer Canaan. They were supposed to be as numerous as the sand of the sea and the stars of the sky. And I mean, through because of their failure to knock out the people of Canaan, their desire to just live next to them, live like them, um, their lack of care for their God's word and His laws, their lack of leadership. I mean, we see just how the Judges period is slowly. I mean, they're at a low point. We'll see once we get into First Samuel, just the state of things in First Samuel. They're going to get the Ark of the Covenant stolen by the Philistines for a time, and then even when Saul is appointed as king, he's going to be he's going to be leading a group that they don't even have swords. Only Saul and his sons were able to have swords, and the rest of his army was just using whatever they could find, sticks and rocks. Well, when you're going up against people with swords, sticks and rocks, usually lose. So that's the state of things, even all the way to the days of Saul. And it's only through, Saul having some success and then David really picking up with that success that the nation of Israel rises up again. So, I mean, it starts out pretty good in Joshua. You start to see little things, hints here and there, and then of course that downward spiral happens quick. I mean, we're only talking probably about a 400-year period from the days of Moses and Joshua, the crossing of the Red Sea, until the days of Saul and David. I think that's the longest. Some people might think it's shorter. Longest we're talking about is 400 years. So, I mean, not a huge amount of time, but definitely long enough for things to go from bad to worse, and try to get a little better by the time we get to David there. So fortunes can turn quickly, but this is a long, difficult period of their history.
Right. And you talk about it, that being hinted, the way that Judges are going to go being hinted, the whole this cycle of sin that we find within Judges, the faithfulness that leads to idolatry and adultery, which leads to affliction and oppression, crying out to God. He sends the deliverer. The judge is the word we've always used, but maybe more appropriate would be the deliverer, the savior, the warlord, the warrior who's going to bring them out of that oppression, which leads to deliverance and continued faithfulness before the cycle starts over again. But as you mentioned, Joshua told us this was going to happen. We might not have expected it to happen so quickly in the Bible story as we have it, But he says in Joshua 24 and verse 14, fear the Lord and worship him in sincerity and truth. Get rid of the gods your fathers worship beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and worship the Lord. But if this doesn't please you to worship the Lord, choose for yourselves today. Which will you worship? The gods your fathers worship beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living? As for me and my house, we will worship the Lord. The people replied, we will certainly not abandon the Lord to worship other gods. For the Lord our God brought us up and our fathers out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery, and performed these great signs before our eyes. He also protected us all along the way. We went, and among all the peoples whose lands we traveled through, the Lord drove out before us all the people, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will worship the Lord because he is our God. They say we're going to worship. But Joshua told the people, verse 19 of Joshua 24, you will not be able to worship the Lord because he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions and sins. If you abandon the Lord and worship the foreign gods, he will turn against you, harm you, and completely destroy you after he has been good to you. What have we seen, Alan, in the past few chapters at the end of Judges? We've seen the Lord destroying Israel even by Israel's hand itself. And it is a cautionary tale. I think that's really probably the best thing to mention as we close out Judges is it is a cautionary tale. It reminds us of the importance of faithfulness to God, not allowing ourselves to be influenced by the paganistic practices around us, the worldly issues that surround us today. We are to be a separate people. We're supposed to be special, set apart from the world by God. A sanctified people is the really high term for that. But we got to make sure that we're standing strong. We got to make sure that we're not just paying lip service like you mentioned today, but that we're really doing everything from our heart, that we're making a very concerted effort to serve the Lord and to not turn from him, regardless of what it is we might face. Alan, what do you have? Anything else to close us up in Judges today before we conclude for today and look forward to our studies in Ruth next week?
That's what I was going to say. Just, despite all this darkness, despite all this negativity and lack of care, lack of love for God, there's still a remnant. God's going to make sure that there's even just a small portion of his people that he will protect and he will watch over. And we see one little bit of that remnant with Ruth and Boaz in this next story, which takes place in this same time period. So not, Israel's not 100% bad. There are some good, even though we don't really see that in Judges, but there will always be a remnant. There will always be a small handful left over that God will continue to protect and make sure. And that's, of course, that's going to lead right up to David. And I was going to mention just how quickly, I mentioned how things started with Saul and their political situation there. I mean, don't even have swords for their army. Well, you have Saul and then David and Solomon, just 2 generations apart from, kind of the lowest depths of where they are in Judges. Well, just by starting to do right through David, starting to establish the proper worship of God, and then of course Solomon building the temple, you have the height of the Israelite nation at this time. So that goodness can come very quickly, but we also seen that depravity and sin can spread just as quickly as well. From the generation of Joshua, even during the days of Phineas, you have all this happening that we just read about. So both can happen quickly. Probably sin sometimes seems like it happens even quicker.
Yeah, and both can happen also simultaneously. While all this, as you mentioned, all this bad stuff's going on there. Here we have Ruth, the very first verse of Ruth, during the time of the Judges, gives us a time frame what's going on. The way it's organized, we're reading things are looking great in Joshua. They turn really sour in Judges. We're thinking there's no hope, but there's Ruth. There's Ruth. And we're gonna see some hope, and that takes place here within this very short and yet beautiful story concerning Ruth and Boaz and the other characters that are found within this short text. We'll be getting into that on Tuesday. You are more than welcome to join us as we get into the text, and hope there'll be a blessing to you as we go through that text together. Alan, thank you again for your great insight as always, and thank you to every one of you for joining us. We would love for you to join us again on Sunday. We're going to be worshiping together at 384 Pleasant Plains Road at 9 a.m. for a period of an assembly for worship. We'd love to have you there. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out and let us know, either here on our Facebook page, even on YouTube. Send us a comment. We'd love to just chat with you and answer any questions you might have, try to serve you with any needs you might have. Again, thank you for being here. God bless you and all that you do. Take care. As we continue to walk through history, the story of God's word is found within the Bible. We have concluded Judges, this dark chapter in this walk, but brighter days are ahead, and we look forward to getting to Ruth next week. Hope you could join us for that. Take care, and God bless.